I once heard an old man say that life never really moves slowly. It only feels slow when you are young, and by the time you realize how fast it was moving, most of it is already behind you. I didn't understand what he meant back then. I was 24, standing outside a small coffee shop on a quiet street in Portland, Oregon, convinced the future stretched endlessly in front of me like an open highway. I believed I had all the time in the world. Decades later, sitting at a wooden desk near the same window where rain still taps gently against the glass, I finally understand what he meant. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I'm 74 years old. At my age, the world becomes quieter in a way that is difficult to explain to someone who is still rushing through their 30s or 40s. The mornings start earlier, the evenings come faster, and the hours in between feel more precious than they ever did before. When you live long enough, something strange happens. The noise fades, the urgency disappears, and what remains is clarity. You begin to see your own life the way you might see a long road behind you in the rearview mirror. Every turn, every decision, every moment you thought was small suddenly becomes part of a larger picture. Tonight the rain is steady, the kind of rain that makes the whole neighborhood feel still. My house is quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock above the fireplace. On my desk sits a blank sheet of paper and a pen that feels heavier than it should. I'm writing a letter to my granddaughter, Olivia. She's 22 years old, just beginning the part of life where everything feels urgent and important. She reminds me so much of who I used to be. Curious, determined, always planning the next step before finishing the last one. When I think about her, I think about all the things I believed when I was her age. The rules I thought life followed. The goals I thought mattered more than anything else. And more than that, I think about the things I didn't understand yet. The lessons that only revealed themselves years later, sometimes quietly, sometimes after a moment that changed everything. If I could sit across the table from my younger self, there are things I would say immediately. Not dramatic warnings, not complicated advice, just simple truths that took me decades to recognize. But time only moves in one direction, and none of us get the chance to go back and whisper wisdom into the ears of the person we used to be. So instead, I write. I write because there are 10 things I wish someone had told me when I was young. 10 lessons that people rarely understand until the calendar has already turned through many seasons. They aren't secrets exactly. Most of them are simple. In fact, that's part of the problem. The most important truths in life rarely look important at first. They hide inside ordinary days, quiet conversations, and moments that seem forgettable until years later. As I begin this letter to Olivia, I pause for a moment and look out the window. The streetlights glow softly against the wet pavement, and the world outside looks almost the same as it did 50 years ago. But I'm not the same woman who once walked down that sidewalk believing life would wait for her. If there is one thing old age gives you, it is perspective. And perspective has a strange way of turning ordinary memories into powerful lessons. So tonight, I will write them down, one by one, the truths I wish I had understood sooner, the things people only realize after enough time has passed to see their own lives clearly. Because the hardest lesson of all is this: life doesn't slow down while you figure it out. It keeps moving quietly forward, whether you're paying attention or not. When I was 22 years old, I believed that the most important thing in life was being liked. That may sound small when you say it out loud, but at the time it felt enormous. I remember standing in front of the mirror in a small apartment I shared with 2 friends in Portland, trying to decide what kind of person I needed to be that day. I did not ask myself what I believed or what I wanted. Instead, I wondered what other people expected. That was the invisible rule guiding my choices. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I smiled when I felt uncertain. I agreed with opinions that did not feel true simply because it seemed easier than disagreement. At the time it felt responsible, even polite. I thought that keeping everyone comfortable meant I was doing something right. What I did not understand was how quietly that habit can shape an entire life. When you spend enough years trying to meet everyone else's expectations, you slowly forget to ask yourself an important question. What do I actually want? I remember one afternoon very clearly. I had just started my first real job at a marketing firm downtown. The office was on the 7th floor of a brick building overlooking the river. I wore a gray blazer that felt far too serious for someone my age, and I carried a notebook everywhere because I believed that serious people always carried notebooks. That afternoon, my supervisor asked me if I was interested in staying late to help with a project. Everyone around the table nodded immediately, so I nodded too. The truth was I had already promised a friend I would meet her for dinner. I had been looking forward to that dinner all week. But in that moment it felt easier to agree than to speak honestly. I stayed late. The dinner never happened. At the time it seemed like a small decision, almost invisible. But those kinds of moments repeated themselves again and again. I stayed late when I was exhausted. I volunteered for things I did not believe in. I reshaped my opinions so that rooms would remain comfortable. The strange thing is that most people never asked me to do any of this. The pressure existed almost entirely inside my own mind. Years later, I realized something that would have saved me a great deal of confusion if I had understood it sooner. Most people are not paying as much attention to you as you think they are. When you are young, it feels like the entire world is watching your decisions. You imagine that every mistake will be noticed and every disagreement will leave a permanent mark. But the truth is far simpler. Everyone else is busy worrying about their own choices, their own problems, and their own fears. The attention you think you are receiving is mostly an illusion created by your own self-consciousness. I did not realize this until I was much older, long after I had spent years trying to keep everyone satisfied. One evening when I was in my 50s, I attended a small class at the community center near my house. It was a writing class, something I had always wanted to try but never felt confident enough to do earlier in life. I sat at a long table with strangers who were also carrying notebooks and quiet hopes. During that class, we were asked to read something we had written. My first instinct was to decline politely. The old voice inside me said that people might judge what I wrote. But something in me had grown tired of that fear. So I read the page out loud. My hands trembled slightly as I spoke. When I finished, I looked around the room expecting criticism. Instead, I saw people nodding thoughtfully, not because the words were perfect, but because they understood the feeling behind them. And in that moment, something simple but powerful became clear. The years I had spent worrying about other people's opinions had been built on a misunderstanding. Most people are not waiting to criticize you. They are simply living their own lives. If I could whisper one lesson to my younger self sitting in that tiny Portland apartment, it would be this. Do not spend your life performing for an audience that is not really watching. The freedom you are searching for has been available all along. One belief followed me quietly through many years of my life, and for a long time I never questioned it. I believed that success would eventually create happiness. It seemed logical when I was young. Work hard, build a stable career, earn respect, and everything else would fall into place. That was the story many of us accepted without thinking too carefully about it. I remember the years when my life began to move faster. My 30s arrived with new responsibilities, new opportunities, and a constant sense that I needed to keep moving forward. I married Thomas Hayes when I was 31. He had a calm voice, thoughtful eyes, and a way of listening that made every conversation feel important. At the time, we were both building our careers. Thomas worked as an architect, and I had continued climbing slowly through the marketing firm where I had started years earlier. We lived in a modest house on a quiet street with tall maple trees that turned bright orange every October. From the outside, it looked like the kind of life people imagine when they think about stability. There were early mornings, busy weekdays, and weekends filled with errands and small projects around the house. Those years felt productive, but they also moved quickly in ways I did not fully notice at the time. My days followed a rhythm that many adults know well. Alarm clock at 6:30 in the morning. Coffee brewing in the kitchen while the sky outside slowly brightened. A drive across the bridge into downtown Portland where the office lights were already glowing in tall buildings along the river. Meetings, deadlines, presentations, and the constant quiet competition that lives inside professional environments. I believed every step forward mattered. Every promotion felt like proof that I was building something meaningful. Yet there were small moments that quietly passed by while I focused on work. Evenings when Thomas suggested we take a walk through the neighborhood, but I said I still had emails to answer. Saturdays when we talked about taking a weekend trip somewhere along the Oregon coast, but decided to postpone it until work became less busy. We always believed there would be more time later. That is one of the most convincing illusions adulthood creates. Later feels guaranteed when you are young. I remember one specific evening that returns to my memory more clearly than the others. It was early autumn. The air outside carried that crisp smell that appears just before the leaves begin to fall. Thomas was sitting at the kitchen table sketching ideas for a building project while I stood near the counter reading through documents from work. He looked up and said something simple. He asked if I wanted to drive out to the coast the following weekend. Nothing complicated. Just 2 days near the water, watching the waves and breathing air that felt different from the city. I remember glancing at my calendar and explaining that the office was preparing for an important campaign. I said we should wait a few weeks until things settled down. Thomas smiled in that patient way he always had and said that sounded reasonable. The trip never happened. Not because of a dramatic event, but because life continued moving forward with new obligations and new schedules. Weeks turned into months, and months quietly turned into years. When I look back now, I realize that success has a way of filling every empty space you give it. Work expands, expectations grow, and the quiet moments that once seemed ordinary slowly disappear. The strange truth is that happiness rarely arrives as a reward waiting at the end of achievement. Instead, it lives inside small experiences that are easy to postpone when ambition feels urgent. The walk around the block after dinner. The weekend drive toward the ocean. The simple conversations that only happen when no one is watching the clock. It took me many years to understand that building a life and experiencing a life are not always the same thing. One creates accomplishments. The other creates memories. And the difference between those two things becomes much clearer when you have lived long enough to look back. There are moments in life that arrive quietly, but change the way you see everything that came before them. For me, that moment happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the sky above Portland looked pale and calm, the kind of afternoon that does not suggest anything important is about to happen. I remember I was sitting at my desk at the office reviewing a proposal that needed to be finished before the end of the week. The room was filled with the familiar sounds of keyboards and distant phone conversations, the small background noise of people moving through another workday. My phone vibrated softly against the desk. When I answered it, I heard Thomas on the other end of the line, but his voice sounded different from usual. He spoke slowly, as if choosing his words with unusual care. He told me he had not been feeling well that morning and had decided to visit a clinic near his office. He assured me that it was probably nothing serious, just fatigue or stress from a busy project. Still, he mentioned that the doctor wanted him to rest for a few days and run a few tests. There was no panic in his voice, only a calm tone that suggested caution. Yet something inside me shifted in that moment. I remember staring out the window of the office building and watching the river move slowly beneath the bridge. The current did not rush. It moved quietly, steadily, without asking anyone for permission. That was the first time I realized how fragile our plans really are. We spend years arranging schedules, setting goals, and organizing the future as if time will always follow the order we expect. But life has its own rhythm, and it rarely checks our calendars before it changes direction. Over the following weeks, Thomas stayed home more often while the doctors tried to understand what was causing his exhaustion. Those days moved differently from the busy years before them. The house felt quieter in the afternoons. Sunlight would move slowly across the living room floor, while Thomas read books in the chair near the window. I continued going to work during the mornings, but something about my priorities began to feel different. The office that once seemed so important suddenly looked like a place where people were constantly rushing toward things that might not matter as much as they believed. One evening I returned home earlier than usual. The air outside carried the cool scent of rain that sometimes arrives in Oregon before the clouds even appear. Thomas was sitting on the back porch wrapped in a light sweater, watching the trees sway gently in the wind. I sat beside him without saying anything at first. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt peaceful in a way I had not noticed for many years. After a while he smiled and said something that has stayed with me ever since. He said that life is not measured by how busy we are, but by how present we allow ourselves to be while time is passing. At that moment, I understood something that had taken decades to reveal itself. We had spent so many years believing that the most important parts of life would happen later, after the work was finished and the goals were achieved. Yet the quiet truth was sitting right there beside us on that porch. The most meaningful moments were not waiting somewhere in the future. They were already happening in ordinary afternoons, simple conversations, and quiet evenings when the world slowed down just enough for us to notice it. That realization did not arrive as a dramatic announcement. It arrived softly, like the first raindrops tapping against the porch roof while the sky above the trees slowly darkened. I began to notice something subtle during those months at home with Thomas, something that had been present for years but hidden behind the noise of routine. Our days slowed down in a way that felt unfamiliar at first. The alarm clock no longer ruled the morning with the same urgency. Instead, sunlight entered the kitchen gradually, while coffee brewed on the counter, and the quiet neighborhood outside our window slowly came to life. For many years our mornings had been rushed. I would check emails before finishing breakfast while Thomas reviewed drawings for his projects. Conversation often became a series of short sentences exchanged between responsibilities. But during that period something changed. We began sitting at the table longer, sometimes without speaking at all. It was not uncomfortable. It was simply peaceful. One morning Thomas placed his coffee cup down and asked me a question that felt strangely simple. He asked me if I remembered the first apartment we lived in after we were married. I laughed immediately because the memory returned so clearly. It was a small place above a bakery on the east side of the city. The kitchen window looked down toward the street where the smell of fresh bread drifted up every morning before sunrise. We did not have much furniture then. Our dining table was a second-hand piece we found at a garage sale, and the chairs never matched. But we talked constantly in that apartment. We spoke about dreams, places we wanted to visit, and the kind of life we imagined building together. As we sat there remembering those early years, I realized something that had slowly changed without my noticing. Somewhere between ambition and responsibility, we had stopped having those long conversations. Not because we stopped caring, but because life had filled every available hour with something that felt urgent. Work schedules, appointments, deadlines. We believed those things were temporary, that someday they would calm down and we would return to the simple rhythm we once had. Yet that someday had quietly remained in the distance. That morning we talked for nearly an hour. Not about problems or plans, but about memories. Thomas described the night we drove 2 hours just to watch a meteor shower outside the city lights. I remembered the weekend we borrowed a friend's old pickup truck and spent the entire day exploring the Columbia River Gorge. The details returned slowly like photographs appearing in a developing tray. What surprised me most was how many of those moments had happened during periods when we had very little money and very few possessions. At the time, we thought happiness would grow later when life became more stable. Yet the truth was sitting there in those memories. Joy had never waited for perfect conditions. It had appeared during simple days when we allowed ourselves to notice what was already around us. That realization stayed with me long after that conversation ended. I began seeing how often people postpone their happiness while preparing for a future that may never arrive exactly as planned. We delay experiences because we are waiting for the right time, the right income, or the right circumstances. Yet life rarely organizes itself according to those expectations. The quiet irony is that some of the most meaningful parts of life happen while we are busy preparing for something else. As I write these thoughts now, I can still picture Thomas sitting at that kitchen table, sunlight moving slowly across the floor while the smell of coffee filled the room. There was nothing extraordinary about that morning. No celebration, no major event, nothing that would have seemed important to an outsider. But when I look back now, I understand that those ordinary moments were never ordinary at all. They were the life we had been building all along, hidden quietly inside the days we once thought were routine. In the years that followed those quiet mornings at home, another truth slowly revealed itself to me. One that I wish I had understood much earlier in life. It is a simple truth, but it changes the way you see almost everything around you. People change, and sometimes they drift in directions you never expected. When I was young, I believed that certain relationships would remain exactly the same forever. Friendships felt permanent. The people who stood beside you in one chapter of life seemed certain to remain there through every chapter that followed. That belief feels natural when you are young because your world is still small enough to hold everyone close. One of the first friendships that truly mattered to me was with a woman named Caroline Mitchell. We met during our first year at the marketing firm where I began my career. She sat at the desk across from mine, and on my first day, she leaned over with a warm smile and asked if I knew where to find decent coffee nearby. Within a week, we were eating lunch together almost every day. Caroline had a bright laugh and a quick way of turning ordinary moments into stories that made everyone around her smile. During those early years, we shared everything from career frustrations to weekend plans. Sometimes after work, we would walk along the riverfront, talking about the future as if we could see it clearly waiting for us just around the corner. At that time, it seemed impossible to imagine a future where we would not be part of each other's daily lives. But life does not always move in straight lines. Careers change. Families grow. New responsibilities quietly rearrange the shape of our days. Caroline eventually accepted a position with a different company across the city. At first, we promised that nothing would change. We would still meet for lunch, still call each other after difficult days, still remain as close as we had always been. For a while, that promise held true. But gradually, the rhythm of life began shifting in ways that neither of us noticed right away. Our conversations became less frequent. Weeks passed more quickly than they used to. Sometimes we would plan to meet for coffee only to reschedule because work demanded attention elsewhere. There was no dramatic argument, no moment of anger, no clear event that pushed us apart. Instead, distance arrived quietly, almost politely, like the slow fading of daylight in the evening. Years later, I saw Caroline unexpectedly at a bookstore downtown. For a brief moment, we looked at each other with the same surprised expression people have when they recognize a memory standing in front of them. We spoke kindly and exchanged updates about our lives. She told me about her children. I told her about Thomas and our home. The conversation was warm, but it carried a strange awareness that we now belonged to different versions of the life we once imagined together. As I walked away from that bookstore, I realized something important. Not every relationship fades because someone has done something wrong. Sometimes people simply grow in directions that no longer overlap. When you are young, you often interpret that distance as failure or loss. But age teaches you to see it differently. Life moves people through seasons, and each season brings different companions along the road. Some stay for many years. Others walk beside you only long enough to teach you something before their path turns elsewhere. Understanding that truth brings a certain kind of peace. It allows you to appreciate the time you shared without demanding that every connection remain unchanged forever. When I think about Caroline now, I do not feel sadness. I remember laughter beside the river and the feeling that the future was wide open. And I understand that those moments were never meant to last forever. They were meant to happen exactly when they did, leaving behind the quiet reminder that every person who crosses your path is part of the story that shapes who you become. Another lesson arrived in my life in a quieter way, one that took many years before I understood what it truly meant. It is the realization that material success and comfort do not automatically create a sense of fulfillment. When I was younger, I believed that if you worked hard enough and built a stable life, happiness would appear naturally as a reward for that effort. That belief is common because society quietly encourages it. We are taught to pursue bigger houses, stronger careers, and financial security as if those things will eventually solve every deeper question we carry inside. During my 40s, I began to notice a man who lived a few houses down the street from us. His name was Daniel Mercer. He had moved into the neighborhood after purchasing a large home at the corner of our block. The house stood out immediately because it was much larger than the others and surrounded by carefully maintained landscaping. Daniel drove an elegant black sedan and dressed in tailored suits that suggested a successful business career. Many evenings when I returned home from work, I would see his lights on through the tall windows of his living room. Sometimes he stood near the window holding a glass of water or looking out toward the quiet street. At first, I assumed he was simply enjoying the peace of the neighborhood the same way many of us did. Over time, I began to notice something else. No one ever seemed to visit that house. The driveway remained empty except for his own car. The porch lights turned on every evening, but rarely welcomed any guests. One autumn afternoon, I was watering plants in our front yard when Daniel walked past the house. We exchanged greetings and began a short conversation about the changing weather and the beautiful colors of the maple trees lining our street. His voice was polite and friendly, yet there was a certain heaviness behind his words that I could not quite describe at the time. Over the next few months, we spoke occasionally when our paths crossed outside. Gradually, I learned that Daniel had built a very successful career in financial consulting. His work had allowed him to travel across the country, invest wisely, and eventually retire earlier than most people his age. On paper, his life looked impressive. He had the house, the resources, and the freedom many people spend decades trying to achieve. Yet one evening, during a longer conversation, he said something that stayed with me long after we finished talking. He told me that the quiet inside a large house can sometimes feel much louder than people expect. He explained that during the years he focused entirely on building his career, he had slowly lost touch with many of the relationships that once mattered to him. Friends had moved away or grown busy with families of their own. Some connections faded simply because too much time had passed without conversation. Listening to him that evening, I realized something that had never been obvious to me before. Success can create comfort, but it does not automatically create connection. Human happiness depends far more on shared experiences than on personal achievements. When we focus entirely on building accomplishments, we sometimes forget to build the relationships that make those accomplishments meaningful. As I walked back inside my house that evening, I noticed the soft sound of Thomas moving dishes in the kitchen while dinner finished cooking. The simple presence of another person in the room suddenly felt more valuable than any career milestone I had ever reached. That moment quietly reshaped the way I understood fulfillment. A comfortable life can provide safety and stability, but true richness often appears in ordinary moments shared with people who truly know you. Years later, I still remember Daniel standing under the golden leaves of the maple tree outside his home, speaking calmly about the silence inside a house that once looked like the symbol of success. His story became a quiet reminder that the things we build are only part of the life we live. The people we share that life with are the part that gives everything else its meaning.